Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into the origins of Indian nationalism.
A fascinating story.
Yeah, how it all started, what were the driving forces behind it, and some of the major turning points. I always thought the road to Indian independence was like this straight line,
Yeah.
just increasing resistance. But going through our main source for today, which is this chapter from a history textbook, ch10.pdf,
Right.
it's a lot more nuanced.
A lot more complex than that. Yeah. It's really a mix of internal and external factors, wouldn't you say? Even the Indian National Congress,
Right.
the organization that ultimately led India to freedom,
Right.
was actually founded with help from a retired British official.
Wait, hold on. Are you serious? You're telling me the British had a hand in creating the group that eventually kicked them out of India?
It's a bit of a historical irony.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. So let's rewind a bit. What else was going on in India at the time that kind of set the stage for this rise of nationalism?
Well, you can't ignore the global context.
Yeah.
Think about the French Revolution and its impact worldwide.
Right.
Ideas about liberty, equality, and national self-determination. They weren't confined to Europe.
Right.
These ideas resonated in India too, and they sparked discussions and challenged the existing order.
So India wasn't like this isolated bubble. It was connected to these global currents of change.
Exactly.
It makes sense that those ideas would find fertile ground there too, but what about internal factors within India itself? Was there something happening within Indian society that contributed to this growing sense of national identity?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This period saw what's often called the Indian Renaissance, a resurgence of intellectual and cultural activity.
Okay.
Thinkers, reformers, artists, they started rediscovering and celebrating India's rich heritage.
Yeah.
And this led to this renewed sense of pride and questioning of those colonial narratives that had been imposed upon them.
It's like they were reclaiming their own story, pushing back against that British narrative that painted India as, backward and in need of Western guidance.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It was all about reclaiming their narrative, and this cultural awakening was really crucial in fostering a sense of shared identity among Indians.
Right.
And ironically, the British themselves played a role in this.
Okay.
Their policies, though, intended to solidify their control, actually inadvertently laid the groundwork for a more unified India.
I'm intrigued. How did they accidentally boost Indian nationalism?
Well, think about it. They introduced a unified administrative system, standardized laws, built railways that connected different parts of the subcontinent.
Okay.
And while these were meant to strengthen their grip on India,
Right.
they also facilitated communication and fostered a sense of shared destiny among Indians from various regions.
It's almost poetic in a way, right?
Yeah.
Their
Yeah.
attempts to control actually ended up planting the seeds for their eventual departure.
Right.
But ideas alone don't make a movement. They need a way to spread to take root and grow.
And that's where the power of the press comes in.
Okay.
Despite facing censorship and restrictions, Indian-owned newspapers flourished. They became vital platforms for disseminating nationalist ideas, challenging colonial narratives, and mobilizing public opinion.
So they used the very tools of the colonizers to fight back. That's brilliant.
Exactly.
I bet those newspapers were filled with, fiery editorials and passionate calls for change.
Absolutely.
But did they all write in English? I mean, India has so many languages. How did they communicate across these linguistic barriers?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Nationalist leaders recognized the need to bridge these linguistic divides.
Okay.
They strategically adopted English as a common language.
Interesting.
This allowed them to communicate with a wider audience and foster a sense of unity across diverse linguistic groups.
So English, the language of the colonizers, became a tool for resistance.
Exactly, a tool for resistance and unity.
That's quite a twist.
It really shows how resourceful and strategic they were, using every available tool to advance their cause. But it wasn't just about challenging the present. They were also looking to the past for inspiration. This period also saw a renewed interest in India's ancient history and cultural achievements.
Okay.
Both European and Indian scholars began challenging that colonial narrative of Indian inferiority.
Interesting.
They unearthed evidence of sophisticated civilizations, advanced scientific knowledge, flourishing trade routes that predated British rule.
Wow. So they were literally rewriting history, reclaiming their narrative, showcasing this glorious past that had been suppressed for so long.
Precisely. And this rediscovery of a glorious past fueled a sense of national pride and self-belief.
Yeah.
It inspired Indians to imagine a future where they govern themselves.
Okay, so we've got this heady mix of global ideas, internal awakening, and a rediscovery of a glorious past. The ingredients for nationalist movement are all there, but how did it actually translate into organized action?
Well, before the Indian National Congress burst onto the scene, there were already several smaller political associations emerging. Groups like the British Indian Association and the Indian Association of Calcutta started advocating for Indian interests, pushing for reforms within the existing system, and experimenting with different forms of political engagement.
So they were testing the waters, figuring out what worked and what didn't, laying the groundwork for a more unified and powerful movement.
Exactly. They were honing their skills, building networks, and articulating a vision for a more just and equitable India, and these efforts would culminate in a pivotal moment, the birth of the Indian National Congress in 1885.
Ah, yes. The birth of the Congress, and if I remember correctly, this is where that retired British official we talked about earlier, A.O. Hume, enters the picture.
That's right, and his role is still debated by historians to this day.
Okay.
Some see him as a British agent trying to create a safety valve to control dissent. Others view him as a genuine sympathizer who believed in the potential of a unified Indian voice.
A puppet master or a true believer. I'm getting some serious mixed signals here.
It's a complex story. We may never know his true motivations, but whatever they were, Hume's actions had unintended consequences. He helped bring together some of the most brilliant minds in India, providing them with a platform to discuss, debate, and strategize.
And that platform, the Indian National Congress, would become the driving force behind India's long and ultimately successful struggle for independence. Amazing how history can turn on such unexpected twists and turns.
It certainly does, and the story of the Congress itself is just as fascinating.
Right.
It went through various phases, adopted different strategies, and ultimately became the vehicle for India's freedom.
And that's a story for our next deep dive.
Absolutely.
But before we get there, I'm curious to hear more about these early political organizations that paved the way for the Congress. What were they fighting for? How did they operate?
That's a great question. They were a diverse bunch tackling a wide range of issues from economic policies and administrative reforms to social justice and education. And their strategies varied too, from polite petitions and reasoned arguments to public demonstrations and boycotts.
Okay, so they weren't just sitting around sipping tea and politely asking for change.
No.
They were actively pushing the boundaries, testing the limits of what was possible within the colonial system.
Absolutely. They were experimenting, learning, and building momentum. And
Yeah.
in doing so, they were preparing the ground for the mass movement that would follow.
Yeah.
Yeah, these early organizations, they were really like the training grounds for the nationalist movement.
Right?
Figuring out how to organize, how to make their voices heard, how to push back against British policies. But their efforts weren't limited to just the political sphere.
Right.
There were also these powerful social and religious reform movements happening at the same time.
Okay.
And these played a surprisingly crucial role in shaping that nationalist sentiment.
That's interesting. I always thought those reform movements were more about internal social issues, like caste discrimination or religious practices. How did they contribute to the fight against British rule?
Well, it's all about the ripple effect. You
Yeah.
see these reform movements, they were challenging traditional hierarchies, promoting education, and advocating for social justice.
Okay.
Essentially, they were creating a more unified and empowered Indian society,
Right.
a society that was better equipped to challenge colonial rule.
So by tackling these internal divisions and injustices, they were indirectly strengthening the movement for independence. Like they were creating this sense of solidarity and shared purpose that transcended those differences.
Exactly. And these reform movements, they also had a profound impact on the rise of a new social force, the middle-class intelligentsia.
Okay.
These were the lawyers, doctors, teachers, journalists, the educated professionals who would go on to form the backbone of the nationalist movement.
Ah, yes, the educated elite. They were the ones who had the skills and the platform to articulate those demands for self-rule. But weren't they also, in a way, beneficiaries of British rule? I mean, they were the ones getting access to Western education and occupying positions of influence within the colonial system.
That's a great point. They were caught in this complex web of contradictions,
Yeah.
benefiting from some aspects of British rule while acutely aware of its injustices. And this tension really fueled their desire for change.
Yeah.
They had the education to understand the complexities of colonial exploitation, and they had the platform to voice their dissent.
It's like they were straddling two worlds, seeing both the potential benefits and the inherent flaws of the system. This must have given them a unique perspective, but were they only looking inward? Or were they also influenced by what was happening in the rest of the world?
Oh, global events played a huge role in shaping Indian nationalist consciousness. The rise of new nations from the ashes of the Spanish and Portuguese empires in South America,
Mhm.
the national liberation struggles in Greece, Italy, Ireland.
Right.
These stories served as powerful inspiration for Indians.
So they weren't just fighting for their own freedom, they were part of this global movement for self-determination.
Ex-
It must have given them a sense of hope and solidarity, knowing that they weren't alone in this fight. But I'm also curious about the role of the British themselves. We've already seen how they inadvertently contributed to the rise of nationalism. Did their actions continue to fuel the movement?
Ironically, yes, you could almost say the British were their own worst enemies in this regard.
Okay.
Their policies, often rooted in arrogance and racial prejudice, often backfired spectacularly, pushing more and more Indians towards the nationalist cause.
Okay. I'm all ears. Give me some examples of these British blunders.
Take Lord Lytton, for example. His viceroyalty was marked by a series of policies that alienated and angered Indians. He reduced the age limit for the Indian civil service exams,
Okay.
making it harder for Indians to qualify for these coveted government positions. He held these extravagant displays of imperial power while millions were suffering from famine.
Oh, wow.
He enacted the Vernacular Press Act, an attempt to muzzle Indian-language newspapers that dared to criticize British rule.
It sounds like he was going out of his way to provoke the very people he was supposed to govern.
It's a classic case of imperial overreach. And these policies, instead of quelling dissent, only fueled the flames of nationalism.
Right.
They were blatant reminders of British arrogance and their disregard for Indian aspirations.
It's amazing how often they seem to miss the mark, like they were completely oblivious to the growing resentment their actions were creating. But was it just Lytton? Or was this attitude pervasive throughout the British administration?
This sense of racial superiority, it was deeply ingrained in the colonial system, from casual racism in everyday interactions to discriminatory laws and policies. Indians were constantly reminded of their subordinate status. It was a constant source of humiliation and anger.
And this simmering anger eventually boiled over in a rather unexpected incident, the Ilbert Bill controversy.
Ah, yes, the Ilbert Bill. It's a perfect illustration of how even a seemingly minor attempt at reform could trigger a massive backlash from the British and expose that deep-seated racism that permeated the colonial structure.
Okay, I'm not familiar with this one. Fill me in.
So Lord Ripon, the viceroy at the time, he proposed a bill that would allow Indian judges to preside over cases involving Europeans.
Well, that sounds pretty reasonable. What was so controversial about that?
You would think so, but the European community in India, they went ballistic. They launched this furious campaign to block the bill, arguing that it would undermine their privileged status and subject them to the inferior justice of Indian judges.
Wow, so even the slightest hint of equality was met with fierce resistance. Talk about a fragile ego.
It was a stark reminder of the deep-seated racism that permeated the colonial mindset. Even a minor concession that could be perceived as a threat to their racial superiority was unacceptable.
This must have been a major turning point for Indian nationalists. It exposed the limits of appealing to British fairness and highlighted the need for more organized and assertive action. But you mentioned earlier that the British, in their attempts to suppress the nationalist movement, actually provided the tools for its growth.
It sounds paradoxical, but it's true. Think about it. They unified the country, they introduced a modern education system, and in their clumsy attempts to control dissent, they inadvertently created spaces for Indians to gather, debate, and organize.
It's like they were writing the playbook for the nationalist movement, providing them with the infrastructure and the platform to challenge their very rule.
It's one of history's great ironies, and it's against this backdrop that we see the emergence of those early political associations that would pave the way for the Indian National Congress.
Groups like the British Indian Association, the East India Association, and the Indian Association of Calcutta. We touched upon them earlier, but I'd love to delve deeper into their activities. What were their main goals and strategies?
They were the testing grounds for nationalist ideas and strategies.
Yeah.
They focused on specific issues, advocated for reforms, and experimented with different methods of political engagement. They were learning how to operate within the system, how to mobilize public opinion, and how to pressure the British authorities.
So they were like the precursors to the Congress, laying the groundwork for a more unified and powerful movement.
Exactly. And their campaigns were surprisingly diverse and sophisticated. They weren't just reacting to British policies, they were actively shaping the political discourse and pushing for a more just and equitable India.
What kind of issues were they tackling? Give me some specific examples of their campaigns.
While they were fighting for everything from import duties on cotton to protect Indian industries to the Indianization of government services, giving Indians more control over their own affairs. They campaigned against Lytton's costly Afghan wars. They protested the Restrictive Arms Act and the Vernacular Press Act, and they even rallied in support of the controversial Ilbert Bill.
Wow.
They were testing the limits of the system, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable.
It sounds like they were learning as they went, building momentum and becoming more and more audacious in their demands.
That's precisely it. They were gaining confidence, expanding their networks, and developing a clear vision of what they wanted for India. And as their efforts gained traction, they realized the need for a more unified and national platform to channel their demands and aspirations.
And that brings us to the birth of the Indian National Congress, the moment when all these diverse threads, the global context, the internal awakening, the British blunders, and the efforts of these early organizations converge to create a powerful force for change. Here we are, 1885, the birth of the Indian National Congress. It really feels like we're watching history unfold, right?
It does.
Like all these different forces coming together to create this powerful movement. And, we've got to talk more about A.O. Hume, that retired British official.
Right.
I mean, the more we talk about him, the more mysterious he becomes.
It is an enigma.
Yeah, like what were his true motives? Was he really trying to help India, or was he just trying to protect British interests?
It's a question that historians are still debating today.
Right, but regardless of his intentions, he did help spark something incredible.
The Congress provided a platform for some of the brightest minds in India to come together to share their ideas and to strategize for a better future.
And it wasn't about like an immediate revolution or demanding independence right away.
No, not at all.
It was much more strategic.
It was a long game.
Yeah.
Their focus was on things like increasing Indian participation in the legislative councils, gaining more control over finances, pushing for administrative reforms that would benefit the Indian people.
So working within the system to create change from within?
Exactly.
But wasn't that kind of optimistic? Hoping that the British would willingly give up their power?
Well, their faith in the British system might seem naive in retrospect, but it was a product of their time.
Right.
Many of them were deeply influenced by liberal ideals. They believed in dialogue and reasoned they saw the British presence as an opportunity for progress, but one that needed serious adjustments.
This was the era of the moderates.
Yes, exactly.
Led by figures like Dadabhai Naveji Gopal, Krishna Gokhale Feroze Shah Mehta. They believed in gradual, incremental progress towards self-rule.
They did, and their strategy revolved around what they called prayer and petition.
Right.
They would present their grievances and demands to the British authorities through carefully worded petitions, public statements, and reasoned debates within those legislative councils.
But they weren't afraid to speak up when they had to.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
They were just politely asking for favors. They were crafting powerful arguments for Indian rights. They were exposing the flaws of British policies. They were demanding accountability, and their critiques were especially sharp when it came to the economic exploitation of India under British rule.
This is where Dadabhai Naoroji's drain theory comes in.
Yes.
He argued that British policies were essentially siphoning wealth out of India, leaving it impoverished and dependent.
He did. Naoroji's work was groundbreaking. He meticulously documented how India was being systematically drained of its resources through unfair trade policies, excessive taxation, and those exorbitant salaries and pensions paid to British officials.
So it wasn't just about abstract ideas of freedom and self-rule. It was about the very real economic consequences of British colonialism.
Exactly.
And they weren't just focused on economics, right? They were also pushing for a whole range of administrative reforms.
They wanted greater Indian representation in government services. They wanted the separation of judicial and executive powers to ensure fairness, and they wanted increased investment in education, healthcare infrastructure for the benefit of all Indians.
It's like they were laying out a vision for a more just and equitable society, even within the constraints of colonial rule.
Absolutely. And they were also staunch defenders of civil liberties.
Okay.
They understood the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble. They saw these as essential for a free and democratic society.
So how do we evaluate the legacy of these early moderates? They didn't achieve full independence, but they really set the stage for the mass movements that would follow.
Their contributions were significant. They instilled a sense of national consciousness. They articulated a vision for self-rule, and they developed the tools of political engagement. They exposed the exploitative nature of colonialism, and they inspired future generations of freedom fighters.
But their moderate approach also had its limitations, right?
Of course.
Their faith in the British system, their reliance on petitions and appeals, their reluctance to really embrace mass mobilization. These would become points of contention as a new generation of nationalist leaders emerged.
Yes, as we move into the 20th century, India was entering a new era. The moderates had played their part, but changing times would demand new strategies and new leadership.
And that's a reminder that history rarely moves in a straight line.
Right.
It's full of twists and turns and unexpected detours, seemingly small decisions that end up having huge consequences.
Absolutely.
The story of India's struggle for independence is a story of courage and resilience and the unwavering belief in the power of collective action.
It's a story that continues to inspire long after India achieved its hard-won freedom.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the origins of Indian nationalism. Thanks for joining us.